Honest cops? How do you put up with corrupt and punk cops? 6 years experience here? For me, personally, probably the first year of law enforcement was the hardest for me because I worked in a very small town with a bunch of old school officers. I wouldn't say I've seen a lot of corrupt cops, but punk cops? Yeah, I've worked with my fair share of those. But back to what I was saying, my first year I was very apprehensive about saying anything if I thought someone was going overboard. And I will even admit, I used to lose my temper at the drop of a hat and was one of those cops. What put everything into perspective for me was during my second year, I watched my sergeant at the time treat a handicapped individual badly. We had neighbors at nearby houses coming out on the porch and witnessing this happen, and I couldn't hold my tongue. I got in the middle of the argument and told my sergeant to cool off. I handled the rest of this certain situation myself, and when we got back to the PD, we got into a huge argument over how it was handled. Got bad enough, the chief was called to the department, and as I saw previously, I went on the record against this sergeant, and in the end, he was demoted after the parents made the complaint. The last few years, I became a chief in a small town. I made it a point to make my officers wear body cameras. That way, if a complaint is made and it is valid, I can take punitive measures from there. I also make it a point to train my new officers on how to treat people and handle situations. Anyone who is in law enforcement knows you can't be nice to everyone. In my opinion, the best tool an officer has at his disposal is verbal judo, as it's often called in some places. Most situations can be diffused if you treat people with respect. We deal with people at their worst in most incidents, and most times they want someone to just vent to. In closing, a quote my father told me when I got into law enforcement is this: "You have to know when to turn it on and when to turn it off, but you always have to stay level-headed and treat people with respect. Most of the time, you'll get it in return." Now, that's quite a feat in 6 years. Must have been some hard work to prove himself to them. Story 2. 10 years in corrections, so this may not be the angle you want, but it has some similar truths. Law enforcement is generally going to attract a lot of alpha personalities and also a lot of people who are pushed around and want to empower themselves. You then get the rest sprinkled in. The alphas who want to solve everything with force and subvert their agency's policies and the law do so by being alphas and getting other officers who otherwise would not behave this way on their own to lie on their behalf. You now have 1 or 2 A-types with a group of admirers running things, because combined they outnumber the guy who is just doing his job. You have leadership who isn't interested as long as the paperwork lines up to protect from lawsuits and is probably an A-type himself. The honest answer to how I dealt with this? I compromised my integrity for years. Years of complicity that still bother me even after I've left the job. Then I got trainer certification, seniority, and supervisor roles, and I started teaching every new body coming through the door that if they come here to bounce someone off a wall, they needed to find a new job. That middle personality doesn't seem to need to find a group. I don't think we naturally gravitate towards one extreme or another. So I created an us versus them mentality from day one for new officers. The boogeyman for them wasn't the inmate, it was the big dude wearing the same uniform as you that was going to make you stress out every night. And it's true, don't know who else can relate, but 99.9% of what made my life miserable at work were coworkers. I actually liked inmates and hated officers by the time I was done. I'm not proud of my answer, but it's probably pretty common. You just have to wait it out if you want to keep your job. Story 3. The most common thing we run into is general incompetence and lack of overall tact. We have cops that believe they are righteous Christians and police work is their calling, and will take every college student with the grass and digital scale to jail to start with their reformation process. We have cops that are champions of justice and want to break down systematic injustice from the inside, and could catch someone red-handed robbing a bank and would rather take them to McDonald's for a meal and try to solve the issues that made the person get into crime in the first place. We have cops that enjoy the nightlife and want to be VIP, so they tip off club promoters about potential inspections and in exchange get VIP treatment on a Saturday night with no cover charge. We have cops that are for whatever reason just incompetent and just misunderstand the law. This goes both ways. Sometimes you have cops that think probable cause is a much lower standard than it is, and others who believe it is a much higher standard than it really is. Ultimately, you try to help and coach people into doing better, much like anyone would do at any job. The really bad stuff that makes the news, like cops planting evidence or favors or bribes, don't happen as much as people would like to believe. It's not that this stuff isn't out there, but usually those people, like most criminals, slip up and get caught and are dealt with accordingly. Story 4. I've been a law enforcement officer for 3 years. I work in a village of about 4,500 people. And honestly, I just do my job. My brother passed away 2 years ago from bad habits. My brother fought with a lot of challenges throughout his life. And while I was employed with my department, my brother caught a criminal charge to a law enforcement officer. The cop who charged him I've never seen eye to eye with, and just last year he was terminated for setting up a buy bust that was botched. But the point of the question is simple. There are these kinds of people in every single profession, and the difference with law enforcement is you can ruin someone's life by not doing your job properly. We have a good crew working for this department, and our every move is documented by body cams. Sure, this profession attracts some crooked people who don't want to help and love the power. But if I find those people ever working in our department, I will do everything in my power to make sure they get dealt with according to the law. Story 5. I'm not from the US, and where I'm from, Singapore, corruption is pretty hard from the ground up. I don't know if it's a cultural thing or if we just have that much more robust of an accountability system, or if it's a mixture of both, but that's just how it is. It's not just management level guys who give care or task forces who are paid to give care. You hear a lot of stories of ground level cops ratting out their own friends without any duress. I wasn't in the force for long, so I didn't personally encounter any corrupt cops myself, but the rare few who didn't play it safe enough and got caught really got it hard. We're talking fired and sent to jail with maximum years and fines. Stuff like smuggling by way of the sea or using their knowledge of their jurisdictions to set up shady side businesses, or using any police powers they have for personal gain, searching up personal info of people for reasons other than investigations. The moment they get caught, they're pretty much 100% done for. One thing that really stood out to me was the difference between cops here in Singapore and right across the border in Malaysia. In Malaysia, they set up speed traps and half the time they book you for unfair reasons, and all you have to do is slip them a paltry sum of money that's way cheaper than the actual fine and go on your way. In Singapore, cops almost never accept bribes. We're scared of the consequences, so even if you slipped $1,000 over, we'd almost all just arrest you for trying to bribe an officer. As an example of how different both forces are, my friends and I took a day trip across the border one weekend and we got caught by a speed trap. My friend was going to slip the Malaysian cop some cash, but then the cop noticed that we were cops too and he turned pale, handed the money back and played it by the book. Apparently they're okay with corruption on their end, but they don't want to get their hands unclean with Singapore's relatively straight-laced police, which I guess is a reassuring indication that even if some corruption does slip through, we don't systematically support it. Story 6. Not a cop, but I worked with a federal law enforcement officer for about a year while he was on leave from his job due to a major knee injury. He worked part-time at my recreational center, so he'd just have free access to the gym. He lived with family in the area during this time and didn't have access to the gym his department building had, and something to do during the day. Great guy. For those that don't know, federal law enforcement agencies like the FBI and federal marshals, I won't disclose what agency he was with, but he wasn't an investigator. He was one of the guys wearing body armor going in and opening doors. Super cool guy with great stories. And I asked him pretty much this question, and he told me something like this, paraphrasing, of course. Basically, in any job or team, there's going to be people who are selfish and willing to hurt people around them or forego common decency to come out ahead. Any workplace, any group is going to have these people. The problem with law enforcement is that it attracts these people. A position of power like this is a big gold nugget dangling in front of these selfish, amoral personality types. The more powerful a position is, the more likely it'll have someone like that there. So what's the difference between a cop's personality and a CEO's personality? The cop was too dumb to run a business, so you have these borderline sociopathic personalities who aren't smart enough to use that personality for business, in our streets with authority over citizens, carrying weapons. Of course, that's not all officers. Most are good people. Most get into law enforcement because they see problems with their community and they want to fix it. My coworker, grew up in poorer, crime-filled U.S. city, and growing up, I saw some rough stuff. Teenagers on bad habits, kids arguing over group disputes. I decided I was going to fix that. I did a few years as a city cop before I realized I wasn't actually helping much with anything. So I joined federal law enforcement agency here, and police officers treat symptoms, but the feds find the cause. There were plenty of corrupt cops along the way, and when I ran into them, I kept working. I'm part of the problem, I guess, because I didn't do something about it, but I figured if I ignored them, let small things slide, and focused on actually making things better, my good could outweigh their bad. So far, I think I've done good, and in federal law enforcement, the good I do definitely outweighs the bad around me. Story 7. My husband, let's call him Joe, was not a straight police officer in South Texas for 5 years. He never put up with it and got caught up with a lot of stuff because of it. In the time he was an officer, he worked for 3 different departments, each one he left due to the corruption he witnessed firsthand. Let me preface all that I'm about to say with the note that my partner is the most good and honest human I have ever met. Anyway, Joe dealt with multiple issues involving corrupt colleagues, from tampering with evidence, ignoring crimes committed by wealthy residents, to telling an opposing party that she should just deal with it because they were tired of her calling them every day. In each situation like this, Joe questioned authority and questioned their integrity. When a colleague would act unethically or display corruption, Joe would call it out. Attempting to talk to his colleagues led to Joe being singled out and made fun of. Attempting to talk to his superiors led to Joe being questioned as if he had acted unethically, or led to Joe being made to feel as if he was barking up the wrong tree and should just keep his mouth closed. He described it like middle school, guys who don't like to feel challenged, who get satisfaction from the power they feel that they have. They use the power they have to overcome citizens and co-workers around them. People who don't agree with them or aid them get targeted. And they didn't just mistreat Joe, they'd mistreat citizens as well. Colleagues spouted inappropriate words, never facing any kind of reprimanding. Superiors would engage in this same kind of talk too. It's dangerous and displays a deep-rooted systemic issue. If the people enforcing the law truly are what they show, what kind of discretion are they using? Likely it means they're targeting and singling out minorities or people that aren't like them. That's what they did to Joe, and based on Joe's stories, that is indeed what they did to citizens as well. I saw someone else comment this, and it really says it best. Policing draws in the best and the worst people. It ends up seeing the good ones quit or moving departments in an attempt to find a better quality of life and less corruption. The bad ones get more and more detached from humanity and don't change. The good ones joined policing in order to help people. The bad ones joined because they wanted to feel empowered and have an outlet for their ignorance and hate. For lack of a better phrasing, they just want to feel justified and protected when they act poorly. I know there are lots of good cops and good departments. In the case of the 3 departments Joe worked for, corrupt or punk cops are more than a few. In Joe's experience, it went from the bottom all the way to the top. It also seemed like the good guy was the one in the wrong. Even when Joe attempted to speak out against and oppose the corruption and unethical actions, it was Joe who got shut down and singled out. Story 8. My Uncle Pat was an NYPD officer for about 40 years. During the 1970s and the 1980s, there was a lot of corruption in NYC. Bribes were common and there were many crooked cops. Uncle Pat told me that most of the cops, although they were crooked, weren't really bad people. They were just regular guys in a police force that didn't have enough people or money. It was a demoralized force in a city full of crime and they didn't get paid much. So they would take money to help pay their bills in exchange for not patrolling a certain block on a particular day, letting a crime happen that they probably couldn't have prevented anyway. Uncle Pat was like the typical NYPD Irish cop you might think of. He had a very strong sense of right and wrong and didn't tolerate nonsense. He admitted that he did take a few bribes when he first joined the force in the 1960s because it was the normal thing to do at the time. But after someone was in an accident, not related to the bribe, on a block he and his more experienced partner chose not to patrol, he never took a bribe again. Even though there was nothing he could have done in that situation, he just never wanted someone to get hurt because he was not there. In the 1980s and 1990s, Uncle Pat played a significant role in helping to reduce corruption within the NYPD. He even received some kind of award or medal from the NYPD, and he was given a medal by Mayor Giuliani himself. I'm not sure exactly what the medal was, but I've never been very interested in police matters, so I don't know the details of the medal. I do remember that there was misconduct a few years ago involving an NYPD officer who took a bribe. Uncle Pat, who was retired by then, was very upset about it. He talked about how one person could damage the entire NYPD's reputation, which the department had worked so hard to improve. He believed that cops who commit crimes are worse than regular criminals because they are betraying the trust that the people of the city place in them to protect them. Story 9. It's really all about respect. Most of the cops I know are kind of shady. I'm not a cop and never want to be one because of how dangerous it is, but I know that the reason so many people end up in prison is because they get treated badly, even by their own family members. This makes them feel really messed up inside and they do dumb things just to feel like they have control over something in their lives. The society we live in just confuses people by telling them they can do anything they want, have any job they want, but that's not true. Other people are always telling us what we can and can't do, and that's why most people end up working behind a cash register their whole lives. I was someone who really believed I could do what I wanted, but it was no use. I felt like I was talking to a brick wall. If you're not rich enough to bribe people, you're not going anywhere. I'll probably end up working in a cafe somewhere, but even then, that's hard when you have to compete with really attractive people. A pretty face usually gets the job over someone who's just average looking, and that's not fair. In school and from our parents, we were always told we could do anything. But when you're young and try to get a better job, it doesn't happen. All the mixed messages make you feel frustrated, confused, and totally misled. It's hard to question your whole life and everything you were told was true since you were a kid. If what we were told was all true, we'd all be doing something more meaningful instead of working behind a cash register. I got myself into a tricky situation once, and the cop I let into my house warned me about the other cops. He said that if it wasn't for him, the other older cops would have taken me out of the house. It wasn't even my fault that they were there. They even went as far as blocking off part of the street. My brother saw it when he was coming back from work. It was really scary. All I know is, don't look a cop in the eye, keep your head down around them, and stay safe online. It's true what these cops are saying in this thread, but the sad part is, if you can't trust the people who are supposed to protect you, well, who can you trust? The answer is nobody. Story 10. I'm not a cop, but I did apply to become one. I haven't heard back yet, but I'm hoping to before the end of the year. I've talked to a lot of cops about what it's like. The short answer to why cops might not speak out against bad behavior is that most of the time, there's very little they can do about it. There's not much reward for speaking up, and there's a huge risk of messing up their own career. There was an episode of Brooklyn Nine-Nine that talked about this. To simplify, the sergeant is up for a promotion, but he has a problem with a cop. He can report the cop, but that probably won't change much, and it could cost him his promotion. On one hand, staying quiet helps the bad cop get away with it. On the other hand, if he gets the promotion, he might be able to do more good and make sure that one day speaking out won't ruin someone's career and will lead to better consequences. It's often like that. Usually there's not a clear way to prove a cop did something wrong, and speaking up could end your career. If you stay quiet, you might have a chance to move up and maybe get to a point where speaking out can actually make a difference and lead to better outcomes. Story 11. I was a cop for 10 years, and I can say I haven't seen corruption, but I have seen people make really bad decisions throughout their career. These decisions tarnished the reputation of the other officers in the community. These decisions were along the lines of different charges, all took place off duty but gained public attention. The thing is, the larger the organization, the higher the chance of negative actions by individuals. Granted, the main difference is the power of the badge, but the same can be said about the civilian workforce. Anytime someone does something negative to affect another person or group, it will have an impact in the public eye. It's important for everyone to hold each other accountable, whether you have a hand in public safety or not. And yeah, you can tell who the punk cops are, even back in the academy. At first, they seem like everybody else, but then you start to notice those little things. Instead of sewing their patches on their shoulders, they're held on with safety pins. Instead of regulation tactical footwear, these guys have 14-hole Doc Martens. Then if you start to look closely, what you thought were normal, clean-pressed trousers actually have zippers all over them. And their belts, which should have their holster and flashlight, it's just a row upon row of unrelated things. That's when you know you're really dealing with punk cops. Alright, that one was a good one to know. And if you're enjoying the video and learning a thing or two, please don't forget to hit the subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 12. I've been retired from law enforcement for 20 years, and I've worked for different sized departments in several states, mostly at the county level. To answer the question, we need to keep a few things in mind. I believe that most cops are good, average people doing a tough job. I also strongly believe that cops should not get special treatment and should be held accountable like any other citizen. So, first, let's talk about the type and size of the police department. Many small towns have a town marshal who might be the only officer in the department. They are often hired by the local city council and are usually commissioned through their local sheriff's department. Some of these positions are even volunteer roles where the marshal takes on all the risks without the support of a recognized department. They only have arrest powers because of their connection to the sheriff's department. This is where the good old boy system starts, with many marshals having lived in the area for years. It's clear that overseeing these departments can be very hard, if not impossible, and often relies on the interactions they have with county and state officers who might notice issues and report them. Next, we have the average-sized town police departments and county agencies. These are usually quite different, especially in how the leaders are chosen. A city police department will have a chief who is appointed or hired by the local council, while a sheriff is an elected position. In my experience, police departments have more oversight, with many having citizen review boards. Sheriff's departments, being more political, operate differently. 3 out of the 4 departments I've worked for contact the state police when an officer is involved in an incident that needs investigation. I've been part of investigating several officers over the years, which led them to being fired, but they were never prosecuted, even though some should have been. In both of these types of departments, hiring and promotions often depend on who you know or who you are related to. Promotions are based on job performance and, to be honest, whether the higher-ups like you rather than through exams. Lastly, there are the large city, state, and federal agencies like St. Louis, Los Angeles, etc. These have strong police unions and are very political. I've never worked for these, so I'll let someone else explain them. Now let's talk about arresting a cop or jailer. First, we have to file a report, which goes up the chain of command. This means it goes to your supervisor or department head who decides whether to take action. Or we can go straight to the sheriff or chief, but that might have consequences for skipping the chain of command. Filing a report can lead to backlash from other officers and social pressure. If the sheriff or chief decides to file charges in smaller departments, there's usually no grand jury system. Charges are filed with the local prosecutor's office, which is a very political position, and they decide whether to pursue the case. I've been involved in filing charges against 4 officers for misconduct, and none were prosecuted, though they were all fired. However, 3 of the 4 departments I've worked for have prosecuted officers in the past, and I've seen them go to prison, but only in the most serious cases and with outside agencies involved. So filing a report to charge an officer has to go through several layers, and each person makes their own decision based on the potential personal and political fallout if the incident becomes public, as well as their sense of professionalism and integrity. They might be related to the person or have known them for a long time, or they might worry about their career or re-election. Is this an excuse? Absolutely not. But it's often how things work, in my opinion and experience. If someone decides to stop the process, the blame usually falls on the person who filed the report. How does this put us in danger? In many counties and small towns, there are only a few deputies and officers on duty at any time. Will an officer be slower to respond to a call for backup? Will the detention staff not rush to help if there's a riot in a cell block? Will you be passed over for a promotion you've worked hard for? In my years, I've only faced this once. I'm not saying it doesn't happen or isn't a concern when your life is on the line, but it's something no cop wants to worry about. The main issue is the stigma of being a whistleblower or snitch. In closing, I've worked with some great sheriffs and officers. I've also met some bad ones who didn't deserve to wear a badge. I've seen times when adrenaline and emotions cloud good judgment and mistakes are made. I support transparency and accountability and wish there was enough funding for every cop to wear a camera and for every report to go to an independent agency. Well, this guy sounds like a good cop with a good understanding of the system. Thanks for sharing. Learned a lot in this one. Also, imagine changing the system would be nearly impossible right now, right? What a pity. Story 13. I'm a cop in a big city. I don't want any bad cops around me, and I'm not sorry when they're gone. It's hard to find bad cops because we're trained to catch criminals, so we know how to hide what we're doing. When cops do bad things alone, like my police academy classmate who was arrested for dating someone not his age group, it's because no other cops knew what he was doing. He visited the girl while on duty in uniform, and since he worked alone, no one knew what he was up to between calls. When the girl's mother found out, guess who arrested him? The police, and that's how it should be. When a group of cops is out of control and covering for each other, just like in any group or organization, rumors start and people put the pieces together. The right cops will find out and start an investigation. Those cops will get fired or arrested, like in our Chad Hawley case. We don't want bad, corrupt, or power-hungry cops anymore. But some bad apples slip through, just like in any organization. The CIA and FBI have double agents and moles, and there are cops who misuse their power. Like criminals, they make mistakes and get caught. I'm glad the cops I know who've been arrested are gone, even if I have to deal with their reputation. No cop I work with would cover for or lie for another cop if they knew they were doing something. It's not worth risking my job, my family's safety, or facing jail time. It's just not worth it. And no cop I know would question me if I reported another cop for bad stuff. I'm not one of those cops, and I don't want them around me either. Story 14. My police department has 16 officers. We work in shifts of 2 or 3, and if we're really lucky and no one is off, we might have 4. It's a small department, so everyone knows each other and has worked together for many years, except for me. I'm the new guy, and I'm on probation for a year. This means I can be fired for even a very small reason, according to my chief. So I'm at the bottom of the hierarchy. To be clear, my opinion doesn't count for much in department matters right now. Let's say I tell my lieutenant that my sergeant is doing something. The information goes to the chief, whose close ally is that sergeant. I'd probably lose my job and then fight some minor issue from 6 months ago to officially let me go. Unofficially, it would be because I spoke out against the chief's favorite, to put it simply. I could hire a lawyer and try to get my job back, but I'm young, just out of college, living at home, and I have bills and student loans to pay. I can't afford the legal and financial requirements for my job. And even if I won and I got my job back, I'd still be under the same administration, facing an unjust work environment. That's my view of the situation. It might sound far-fetched, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are good old boy departments out there still, just like this. Story 15. I'm retired now, and I can tell you that most bad cops are reported to their department's internal affairs division, and that's where it starts. Depending on how serious the charges are, the officer might never find out who reported them. If it's a criminal matter, they have the right to know, but if it's just administrative, they probably won't. Despite what you see in movies, not all officers dislike the internal affairs guys. They have a tough job, and I actually admire them. I've had an IA investigate me more than once because of a complaint, and they were thorough in getting to the truth. I was cleared each time, but it wasn't because they didn't try hard enough or try to cover anything up. Usually, a really bad officer will show themselves without needing to be reported by someone else. The officers you see in the news are often those kinds of officers. What you don't see in the news, especially on a national or international level, are the officers who are fired long before they do anything that stupid. The system isn't perfect, and I'll be the first to say it, but it's what we have. Officers have the same rights as any employee of any company, especially if they're part of a union. Just so you know, I had to arrest a fellow officer for DUI, not just once, but twice. The second time, I had to send my police dog after him because he wanted to settle. He lost his job, of course. You might wonder why he was still working after the first time. Here in the US, you're considered innocent until proven guilty. He was on desk duty until his court date, and the second incident happened then. Even the union wouldn't support him after that, so he was fired. Story 16. Good cop here. I suppose that's not for me to decide, though. I want to preface this by saying that I have never been involved nor witnessed an act of corruption amongst my fellow officers, so, in a sense, my point of view may be limited. I think the big issue the public fails to realize is that police are humans too. We make mistakes, we get tired, we get angry, we have all the issues you guys do when you go through life. The big difference we run into is that our mistakes can cost a life. Even stupid clerical mistakes can prevent someone from being released from jail or maybe the wrong person getting released. But we will make those mistakes. Even as good officers, we mess up. We go overboard, plain and simple. The reason I say all of that is because a lot of the things you see on TV where bad cops do something wrong are mistakes, and are not something that is typical for that officer. Sometimes it is, most often it isn't. However, in speaking about corrupt or morally bankrupt officers who use their authority for all the wrong reasons, there's a few issues there. First and foremost, there is a culture of protecting our own. I think it boils down to us seeing each other as people willing to put on the uniform and risk our lives. So we value that more highly than their moral scruples. Other issues stem from that, like speaking up and then getting ruined, no promotions, bad assignments, etc. We have families and we want to move up and make more money, so we stay quiet. Or even if the brass isn't the issue and it's just other cops on our level, they can make our jobs even worse or more dangerous by ignoring our calls for assistance, not answering their calls and asking us to pick up their slack, etc. I'm not saying any of these reasons are good. I'm not saying they're acceptable even. I'm simply saying that these are some of the reasons we have. Also, just for clarification purposes, I know I included myself by saying we and us. This is only because as an officer, I understand the mentalities and the things we all go through, and I don't hold myself higher than other cops. I still make mistakes and will continue to do so, but I will also still put on my uniform and try every day to do the best I can, like 99% of us do. Story 17. I used to be a police officer. Just like in any job, most people are good and try to do the right thing, but there are always a few who aren't. Sometimes it's the person who thinks their weapon and badge give them the right to show power over the public, or the one who's too competitive, or the one who sees every small mistake as a personal insult. Luckily, the system usually does a good job of cleaning itself up. A guy I went to the police academy with didn't pass the psychological evaluation and couldn't get hired. A few months later, he was arrested on some charges. But sometimes bad officers do get through. There was one officer I had to work with who used a weapon on about 20 people in his first 3 to 4 months on the job, including a man who was already handcuffed in the back of a patrol car. In contrast, I only used my weapon on one person in my first 3 years. I only had to work with him a few times, but I made sure to document everything carefully. For example, I helped him with a traffic stop where he pulled the driver out of the car and tried to search him for no good reason. He had stopped him for his taillight. I told him he was out of line and that I would handle the stop. When he argued, I called our supervisor. I gave the driver a complaint form and the officer's name and badge number. This officer was eventually put on desk duty after getting too many complaints, but as soon as they let him back on the road, he hurt a guy who ran a red light. They still let him patrol, but he kept getting into trouble, and I think they finally fired him after he pulled a weapon on an off-duty officer during a traffic stop. Laws that protect employees can be really tough to deal with. And I guess the officer who was given too many chances needed some anger management too. Story 18. I'm a cop and it's a bit strange to say that. Before I became an officer, I found it hard to understand something, but now I work patrol in one of the biggest cities in California, and I get it. Bad officers get arrested all the time. Almost every police department in the country has had to arrest one of their own at some point. The tough part isn't arresting another officer, it's starting or investigating some kind of action against them. This could be telling someone about a problem, being a whistleblower, talking to a commander, or filing a complaint. It's not an easy process because once you start, you can't take it back. By filing a complaint, you're basically labeling yourself as a whistleblower to your department and colleagues. It's not like being a tattletale, it's seen as betrayal. When you file a complaint, the person you're complaining about will find out who you are. You can't stay anonymous. And once they know, the whole department will know. So before complaining, officers ask themselves, how will this affect my future? The seriousness of the issue has to be more important than their own future with the department. What makes this hard are the consequences and risks of doing the right thing. It's tough to admit, but it's true. I want to work for my department for 30 years and enjoy it because being a cop is a lifelong career. But that won't happen if I'm excluded. Being seen as a whistleblower is dangerous in this job. Your friends might turn on you and not trust you. People will avoid you and be careful what they say around you, worried you'll complain about them. When you're on a call, your partner won't use their best judgment in front of you. No one will help you if you need it. The friends of the person you complain about will keep their distance from you. You'll never be a detective, get an award, or be seen as a good officer by the department. Your 30 years will be spent on patrol with no chance for advancement or a better future. Your future ends the moment you file that complaint. I've seen it happen to friends who are good cops but didn't realize how much the complaint would affect them. Other officers are hesitant to help them, don't invite them for drinks after work, and show them no respect. In this job, I need a strong relationship with my coworkers because they're the ones who could save my life in a dangerous situation. I don't want my partner to hesitate about taking risks for me. 30 years is a long time to deal with the consequences of being excluded, which is why the risks are so high and why officers always ask themselves that important question. Until I don't have to ask myself that question, things will stay the same. There needs to be a way to protect the officer who starts the complaint while being fair to the person being complained about, but we're not there yet. Story 19. I'm a correctional officer and I've been doing this job for 2.5 years. Because the turnover rate is so fast, I actually have more seniority than half of the people on my shift. I agree that inmates aren't really that bad if you show them respect and they do the same to you. There are definitely some troublemakers, but they're usually kept in a different area which I don't work in. I like to joke around with my inmates, build a good relationship with them, and talk about things like the news or sports games. I'm not friends with these guys, and they know better than to think they can use our rapport to snitch on others. Only the big-time inmates think that being friendly with an officer means they're a snitch. I get along with 95% of my colleagues, but there have been 2 officers I just couldn't work with. The first one was completely incompetent and just didn't have the right mindset for this job. The second one, though, was a whole different story. He caused a lot of tension in my unit by threatening inmates, locking people up for no reason, and stopping their phone calls, which is a big no-no. He even taunted me for not being tough enough. I went straight to my boss and said, I can't work with this guy. He's going to get himself hurt, me hurt, and our unit could end up in chaos. My boss agreed and moved him to a different area. To this day, that second officer still thinks I'm a rat and won't even look at me. I later found out that 99% of my shift also refused to work with him before all of this happened, and they thanked me for going to the bosses about it. The secret to being a good CO is to appear strict on the surface because inmates will take advantage of kindness, but deep down, you're fair, respectful, and just want the shift to go by without any serious incidents. Story 20. I've been a police officer for almost 10 years, working in 2 different departments. I've witnessed 3 situations where there was a misuse of power. One involved using too much force. I reported my superior officer and he was put on leave before resigning a few days later. He was eventually charged and pleaded guilty to 3 charges for what had happened. Another case was an officer who accused someone. I spoke up and the charges were dropped. The officer was fired. This was a terrible experience for that person. I tried to address the issue with my superior that night, but I wasn't taken seriously. So the next day, I went straight to the chief's office, which led to a full investigation. The third incident involved an officer who shared information about ongoing investigations to the public for personal reasons. It wasn't as serious as the other cases, but he was still suspended. The point I want to make is that I became a cop to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. I've never encountered the blue line that people often talk about on forums, but I'm sure it exists in some places. I've only been recognized for my honesty and integrity. Story 21. My grandfather worked tougher times where it was more prevalent and told my brother and I the same thing when we joined the force. Don't ever let corruption get in your way. Stand up to it. Be the change. It's a lot less prevalent nowadays, at least in my area, and the one corrupt lieutenant who did have gotten himself erased. Unfortunately, it was just a forced retirement, but no one ever brings him up. If I were to see it, I would have to call it out. There is a difference, however, from being a punk cop who gets his work done efficiently without much harm and just an egotistical cop looking to misuse his power. It's not as bad as the news makes it out to be, especially since they teach ethics in the academy. Also, not to mention, I was commended for going to college before applying and taking ethics and human interaction courses, as well as doing well in those classes. My grandfather is really glad it wasn't as bad as it used to be. Story 22. I've worked for a really big police department and now I'm working for a large one. I've seen a lot of people get fired, prosecuted, and even sent to jail, so it's hard for me to believe that there aren't consequences for bad behavior. The only time people get picked on for reporting others is when it's just about someone breaking small department rules like taking a lunch break that's too long or not filling up the patrol car with gas after their shift. I've never seen anyone get seriously teased or face real trouble for reporting criminal behavior in a long time. Here's the thing, no one is really willing to stick out for others whether they're doing something good or bad. So if I gave my lieutenant a real criminal complaint, he has to look into it. He has to send it through the proper channels because he never knows if I might just decide to go to the newspaper with the information. If he doesn't handle it right, he could get in a lot of trouble. Alright, if you learned a thing or two from any of these stories, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video and thanks for hanging with me on this one.